G'day everyone. Today we're going to be looking at 2 Peter chapter 1 verses 3 to 11. So grab that, have a read and come back in a sec. Now this is one of those really great practical passages for living as Jesus followers. Now I was taught that when you teach about the fruit, you should always teach about the root. And what I mean by that is, well, passages like this teach us about how to live as Christians, about the fruitful living as a Christian. But the root of Christianity, the start of Christianity, the basis of Christianity is always God's grace. And I constantly need to remind myself of this, so I want to remind you as well. Because otherwise I'm tempted to think that doing things like what it says in this passage is what's going to make me right with God, when only what God's already done through Jesus can do that. Anyway, if you start and you look at verses 3 to 4, we'll see that his divine power is what gives us everything we need for a godly life, through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Through these, he has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. So he's teaching us about how to live a godly life. And God gives us some things so that we can do that. First of all, he gives us knowledge of himself. We know what God's like. We can know what he wants from us. We can know what he says is good. And most clearly, we can know what God is like by looking at Jesus. When we look at Jesus, we see God and we know what he's like. We also have his great and precious promises. Some of those, of course, will help us to live godly lives. Or the promises of a hope of a future with God will help us to live godly lives here and now. The promise that we have God's help in living his way by his gift of the Holy Spirit will help us to do that. The Holy Spirit teaches us to say no to sin and yes to godly living, as Titus puts it. And so then he moves on from there and he gives us this list of virtues. In other words, what it looks like to do just this, what godly living looks like. And it looks like faith and goodness and knowledge and self-control and perseverance and godliness and mutual affection and love. So as Christians, we should always be trying to grow in each of these areas. Now, I used to think it was like a progressive list, like laying bricks. Like when you master one, then you can move on to the next one. But rather, it's that you should be growing in all of these areas simultaneously. And the problem we have when we look at lists like this, or the problem I have at least anyway, maybe you're different, is that I compare myself to yesterday's version of myself, and then I get disappointed and frustrated and I say, well, why aren't you growing? Why can't you give up that problem? Why are you still, sinful in that area? But the problem is that we should, or the solution rather, is that we should rather compare ourselves to who we were years ago, because it's over time that we see that God works in us and he changes us and he matures us and he makes us more like Jesus. So this is how we know how God is working in us. Some people look for all kinds of miraculous things to see if God's working in them. Maybe it's that everything will go well for them. Everything will just be great. And when then things don't go so great, then they begin to doubt God. Or maybe you've prayed, or that some people have prayed a particular prayer, and when that prayer isn't answered the way they want, that's when they doubt God. But Peter tells us it's actually through rather ordinary means that we know that we're growing to be more like Jesus. If we start to look more and more, strangely enough, like Jesus himself, then we know that he's working in us, because Jesus is the one who exemplified all these things: faith and goodness and knowledge and self-control and perseverance and godliness and mutual affection and love.